They actually poured glue, industrial-strength superglue, into the locks of my own damn house. I'm not even kidding. Stood there with my key, ready to go inside after a long day, and it just wouldn't turn. Solid. Jammed. Completely and utterly sealed. And the sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was that the person I knew, deep down in my gut, was responsible, the HOA president from hell, had absolutely no earthly idea that when she messed with me, she wasn't just messing with a new neighbor. She was messing with her landlord. And not just her landlord, oh no. She was messing with the landlord of the vast majority of the houses in our exclusive little enclave. And if she thought glue in my locks was a power move, she was about to get a PhD in playing stupid games, winning stupid prizes 101. Drop a comment right now. Let me know where you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about how one power-tripping suburban tyrant learned that the hand that feeds you can also, very decisively, take the plate away. How did I even get here? Standing on my own porch like a baffled burglar. Well, buckle up, because it started, as these things often do, with a little bit of new paint and a whole lot of unchecked ego. I'd recently decided to move into one of the properties within a larger portfolio I'd acquired some years back, Willow Creek Estates. Sounds idyllic, doesn't it? Manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, the whole 9 yards. I'd mostly left the day-to-day management of these properties to a company, but I wanted a change of pace, a place to actually live for a while, and one of the recently vacated 3 bedrooms on Ashworth Lane seemed perfect. Quiet street, good light, decent-sized yard. I'd spent years investing in real estate, building up a portfolio primarily consisting of single-family rental homes in desirable neighborhoods like this. It was a solid business, run professionally and, I thought, pretty discreetly through various LLCs. Little did I know, moving into one of my own properties would put me directly in the crosshairs of the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, one Mrs. Karen Crenshaw. That wasn't her real name, but it fits so perfectly, you'll see. From here on out, let's just call her President Karen. She had that look, you know. Hair sprayed into a blonde helmet that could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, a rotating collection of brightly colored pantsuits that screamed, retired but still important, and a voice that could curdle milk at 50 paces. She drove a slightly dated but impeccably maintained cherry red Mercedes convertible, usually with the top down and a silk scarf fluttering, like she was perpetually on parade. I saw her cruising slowly past my place the day the movers arrived, her lips pursed into a little mow of inspection. The first HOA violation notice arrived less than 48 hours later. My recycling bin, apparently, was placed 3 inches too close to the curb. 3 inches. It came with a grainy, zoomed-in photo. I remember chuckling, thinking it was a bit overzealous, but I dutifully moved the bin. No biggie. Then came the notice about the length of the grass in the front yard. It had exceeded the mandated 2.5 inches by, according to her little plastic ruler which she'd evidently used, a full 1/4 of an inch in one patch near the azaleas. This notice was hand-delivered by Karen herself, who rapped on my door with an alarming ferocity. "Just ensuring our community standards are upheld, dear," she trilled, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, which scanned past me into my hallway with an unnerving intensity. "We all have to do our part to maintain property values. I'm a reasonable person. I believe in rules, to a point. I understand HOAs serve a purpose, usually. So, I complied. I even went out and bought a new lawnmower, with more precise height settings. I attended the next HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, a rather beige, soulless building that Karen seemed to regard as her personal Versailles. I wanted to introduce myself, be a good neighbor. The meeting was an eye-opener. Karen held court at a long laminate table, flanked by 2 rather meek-looking individuals who comprised the rest of the board. A nervous man named Gary who jumped every time Karen spoke, and a woman named Deirdre who seemed to communicate exclusively through anxious eyebrow movements. Karen did 90% of the talking, shooting down any suggestions with a dismissive wave of her hand, referencing bylaws that apparently only she had a comprehensive understanding of. and generally making it clear that Willow Creek was her fiefdom. I noticed then that many of the homeowners in attendance seemed somewhat cowed. Later, I'd realize why. They weren't homeowners. Most of them were tenants. My tenants, as it happened. But at that point, I was just another face in the crowd, the new resident of 12 Ashworth Lane, apparently already on President Karen's radar for my rogue recycling bin and offensively long grass. The infractions continued. The paint color of my front door, which was the original color from when the house was built, was suddenly not in keeping with the approved palette. Despite half a dozen other houses having the exact same shade, the decorative wreath I hung for autumn was deemed excessively seasonal in mid-October. Each notice was more passive-aggressive than the last, often accompanied by condescending advice or veiled threats of fines. I tried talking to her, calmly, rationally. Karen, I'd say, I'm happy to comply with reasonable guidelines, but some of these seem a little subjective, don't you think? Her response was always a variation of, rules are rules, dear. If you don't like them, perhaps Willow Creek isn't the place for you. The thinly veiled suggestion that I should move out of my own damn house was not lost on me. And through it all, she had this smug, condescending air, like she was doing me a tremendous favor by even gracing me with her attention. Her favorite phrase, often deployed with a sharp glance over the rims of her reading glasses, was, well, in my experience as president, as if that bestowed upon her some divine right of judgment. Little did she know, my experience as an investor and property owner spanned decades and cities, and I dealt with far more challenging characters than her, though, admittedly, none quite so gratuitously irritating on such a personal level. The glue incident was the culmination. It was after a particularly contentious exchange, where I'd politely but firmly questioned a proposed new rule about the precise shade of white permitted for window blinds. Karen had turned a rather alarming shade of puce. That evening, I came home to the superglued lock, my front door, my way into my home, blocked by a malicious act of vandalism. My security camera, a discreet little dome I'd installed more for package deliveries than anything, had caught it all. A figure, bundled up despite the mild evening, furtively approaching my door, head down. But as they turned, just for a second, the porch light caught the unmistakable glint of Karen's oversized rhinestone flamingo brooch, a hideous thing she wore on her favorite mauve jacket. And then, the distinctive profile of that helmet hair. It was her. No doubt about it. The anger that surged through me was cold, sharp, and immediate. This wasn't about grass length or bin placement anymore. This was a deliberate criminal act designed to intimidate and harass. This was war. And President Karen Crenshaw, in her infinite arrogance, had no earthly idea who she'd just picked a fight with, or the sheer scale of the arsenal I had at my disposal. Patiently waiting in filing cabinets and encrypted server drives, she thought she was the queen. She was about to discover she was just a pawn in a much larger game, one whose rules I was about to rewrite completely. The immediate aftermath of discovering my front door lock was a superglued paperweight, involved a rather expensive emergency locksmith, a police report, and a furious internal monologue that probably could have powered a small city. The locksmith, a gruff but sympathetic man named Sal, muttered about HOA psychos under his breath as he drilled out the ruined mechanism, a sentiment I was beginning to wholeheartedly endorse. "See this a couple times a year, lady," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "Someone gets a bee in their bonnet over a rosebush. Next thing you know, slash tires or this." He gestured at the pile of metal shavings. People got too much time on their hands. The cost to repair the damage was significant, not just the lock itself, but the surrounding doorframe, which had inevitably suffered. I saved the receipt, meticulously, and the police report? Filed it immediately. While the security footage wasn't crystal clear facial recognition quality from that angle in the dark, the flamingo brooch and the distinctive silhouette were, to my mind, damning. The officer who took the report was polite but non-committal, citing the need for more definitive proof linking Karen directly. Standard procedure, I understood. but it still grated. I knew. That was enough for now. The sheer pettiness of it, the malicious intent, it lit a fire under me. President Karen Crenshaw wasn't just an annoyance anymore. She was a genuine menace who thought she could act with impunity. It was time to gently, or perhaps not so gently, disabuse her of that notion. My first step was to stop thinking like a frustrated neighbor and start thinking like the investor and property owner I was. I requested, formally, as a member of the HOA, copies of all meeting minutes for the past 2 years, the complete current bylaws, the declaration of covenants, conditions, restrictions, CC, rupees, and the HOA's detailed financial statements. Karen, legally obligated to provide them, stalled for as long as she could, but eventually, a thick manila envelope landed on my doorstep, my repaired doorstep. Reading through them was like wading through a swamp of legalese and petty tyranny. Rules for everything from the acceptable diameter of garden gnomes, not to exceed 6 inches, to the precise angle at which satellite dishes could be installed, never visible from the street, naturally. The financials were more interesting, not obviously fraudulent at first glance, but Karen certainly seemed to enjoy a generous administrative expenses budget for someone running a relatively small community HOA, largely comprised of properties that were, shall we say, very familiar to me. And that's when the first, quiet click of the tumblers falling into place happened. As I cross-referenced the list of HOA members and their addresses with my own extensive property management spreadsheets, a slow smile spread across my face. I already knew, in an abstract sense, that many of my rental units were within Willow Creek. It was one of the reasons I'd bought the portfolio years ago. A developer had overextended, and I'd picked up a block of well-built, desirable single-family homes at a reasonable price. They were managed by my property firm, a separate entity with its own staff, and the individual properties were held by distinct LLCs for liability and organizational purposes. President Karen Crenshaw, it turned out, resided at 7 Privet Drive, and 7 Privet Drive was owned by Oak Lane Holdings LLC. And Oak Lane Holdings LLC? That was mine. All mine. My smile widened. President Karen Crenshaw, the woman who had just tried to bar me from my own home, was, in fact, my tenant. The sheer delicious irony of it was almost too much. She paid her rent to my property management company, likely never once thinking about who the ultimate beneficiary owner of Oak Lane Holdings LLC might be. To her, I was just the annoying new neighbor at 12 Ashworth. She had no idea I also held the lease to her precious, pant-suited perch. The investigation deepened. I pulled Karen's lease agreement. Standard stuff, mostly, but with very clear clauses about tenant behavior. Tenant shall not engage in any activity that unreasonably disturbs other residents or constitutes a nuisance. Tenant is responsible for any damage to the property beyond normal wear and tear. Gluing neighbor's lock, I mused, probably fell pretty squarely into unreasonably disturbing other residents and causing a nuisance, not to mention the criminal damage aspect. I then cross-referenced the rest of the HOA board. Gary, the nervous yes-man, tenant, 14 Willow Way, owned by Elm Street Investments LLC, also mine. Deirdre, of the expressive eyebrows, homeowner, unfortunately. But 2 out of 3 board members were my tenants, and as I scanned the wider membership list, the numbers became overwhelmingly clear. Out of the 75 homes in Willow Creek Estates, my various LLCs owned a staggering 52 of them. I wasn't just a landlord in the HOA. I was, for all practical purposes, the HOA, or at least its dominant property owner. Karen's entire power base, the voting members she cajoled and intimidated, were overwhelmingly my tenants. Tenants who were likely unaware that their actual landlord was the quiet woman down the street whose wreath was excessively seasonal. Karen's campaign of harassment against me hadn't ceased, of course. Another notice arrived, this time claiming my porch light fixture, again original to the house, was unapproved and needed to be replaced with one from a list of 3 ludicrously expensive options she'd helpfully provided. Fines were threatened. She even started badmouthing me to other residents, little snippets of which drifted back to me through a couple of the more disgruntled, and soon to be very grateful, tenants I'd started to quietly cultivate as sources of information. They were tired of Karen's reign too. One of them, a nice older lady named Mrs. Henderson from 23 Maple Close, another of my properties, told me Karen had referred to me at the last unofficial garden club tea as that rather difficult woman on Ashworth who seems to think rules don't apply to her. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I scheduled a consultation with my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Claire who specialized in real estate law and had handled many of my acquisitions. I laid out the whole saga: the escalating harassment, the glued lock, Karen's HOA tyranny, and then, the kicker, my ownership of the majority of the properties, including Karen's. Claire listened patiently, her expression growing more incredulous, then intrigued. Then finally, a slow, predatory grin spread across her face. "Well, well, well," she said, leaning back in her leather chair. "This is what we in the legal profession like to call an antagonist with a glass jaw they don't know they possess. You hold all the cards here. All of them. We discuss strategy, direct confrontation, a slow burn, legal notices." Claire confirmed what I suspected. As the landlord, I had significant leverage over Karen and Gary through their leases. As the majority property owner, I could, with enough coordinated action from my tenants, who would likely be thrilled to oust Karen, effectively take control of the HOA itself. President Karen, Claire mused, tapping a pen against her chin, thought she was the queen of Willow Creek. She had no idea she was merely a tenant in your far larger kingdom, and it sounds very much like rent is about to come due, in a manner of speaking. You have the power to make her life very, very uncomfortable. All perfectly legally. The plan began to crystallize, not born of heat of the moment anger, but of cold, calculated strategy. Karen wanted to play with rules and power? Fine. I just happened to own the whole damn rulebook and the entire game board. She had drawn first blood with that glue. Now it was my turn to respond, not with petty vandalism, but with the full, crushing weight of legal and financial reality. The urge to march directly over to 7 Privet Drive, my 7 Privet Drive, and lay into President Karen with a full broadside of accusations and revelations was, I admit, incredibly tempting. Picturing the look on her face as the carefully constructed edifice of her petty tyranny crumbled around her was a satisfying mental image. But I'm a strategist at heart. I've built a successful property portfolio not through impulsive actions, but through meticulous planning and understanding the long game. A screaming match on her doorstep would be cathartic for about 5 minutes, but it wouldn't achieve the lasting change or the delicious karmic justice I was aiming for. No, this required precision. It required irrefutable evidence and an impeccably timed execution. So, I began to assemble my ammunition. My home office, usually dedicated to market analysis and acquisition paperwork, transformed into a war room. First, the leases. I pulled every single lease agreement for the 52 properties my LLCs owned within Willow Creek. I highlighted relevant clauses, sections on tenant conduct, responsibilities regarding common areas, which, amusingly, Karen policed with such vigor, clauses regarding nuisance behavior, property damage, and, critically, adherence to all community rules and HOA covenants. Karen Crenshaw's lease for 7 Privet Drive got special attention. It was like reading a script custom written for her downfall. Every petty rule she'd gleefully enforced upon others, every standard of behavior she'd demanded, was right there in black and white, binding her. Next came the documentation of her transgressions. Every single bogus violation notice she'd sent me was scanned and filed. I made detailed notes of our interactions, her specific wording, the dates, the times. I had Sal, the locksmith, provide a sworn affidavit detailing the damage to my lock and the cost of repair. The police report, while not leading to immediate action, was another crucial piece of paper. My security camera footage of the Flamingo Brooch Express was copied and secured. I then delved deeper into the HOA's operational documents. Claire, my attorney, had pointed out that even minor procedural missteps by an HOA board can be grounds for challenge. I cross-referenced meeting minutes with the bylaws, looking for inconsistencies, improper votes, or instances where Karen had clearly overstepped her authority, even by her own convoluted rules. There were several. Nothing quite at the level of embezzlement, it seemed. Karen was more interested in power than outright theft, thankfully, but certainly enough procedural sloppiness to add to the growing pile. The next phase involved my other tenants, the silent majority of Willow Creek, who were also subject to Karen's whims. I didn't want to cause a panic or overtly incite rebellion, but I instructed my property management company to send out a subtle, carefully worded communication to all tenants in Willow Creek. It was a friendly reminder about their rights and responsibilities under their lease agreements, particularly emphasizing the clauses about harassment from other residents and the mechanisms for reporting such issues, not to the HOA initially, but directly to the property management. It also subtly highlighted the landlord's commitment to ensuring quiet enjoyment of their homes. It was a gentle nudge, a way of letting them know they weren't powerless. Several tenants, including the lovely Mrs. Henderson, reached out almost immediately, detailing their own long-standing frustrations with Karen's micromanagement and often bizarre edicts. Mrs. Henderson, for example, had been cited for having unharmonious wind chimes. The stories were a mixture of comical and infuriating. These tenants became my informal intelligence network, providing updates on Karen's latest pronouncements and moods. Meanwhile, Karen, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beyond her perfectly manicured petunias, continued her crusade. She'd escalated from paper notices to more direct confrontations. She'd ambush me if I was out getting the mail, launching into tirades about the unacceptable state of my perfectly acceptable lawn edging, or the fact that I sometimes left my garage door open for more than the approved 30-minute window while doing yard work. Each encounter was an exercise in supreme self-control on my part. I remained polite, almost blandly agreeable, while inwardly cataloging every word. The stress was definitely mounting. It's one thing to deal with difficult business associates. It's another entirely to have your own home, your sanctuary, become a battleground with someone who seems to derive genuine pleasure from making others miserable. The financial cost was also ticking up. The lock repair, the time spent dealing with her nonsense that could have been spent on my actual business, even the mental energy. And all this, knowing she was living in one of my properties, theoretically under an obligation to be a model tenant. The irony was a constant, simmering companion. Then came the perfect, almost poetically unjust escalation from Karen. She sent a formal violation notice, not to me at 12 Ashworth Lane, but to Oak Lane Holdings LLC, the corporate owner of 7 Privet Drive, her own rented house. The violation? Failure to maintain the exterior paintwork on the south-facing fascia board, which is exhibiting signs of minor flaking, and the presence of a small, unauthorized, decorative garden gnome, ceramic, approximately 7 inches in height, near the mailbox. She was, in essence, citing her own landlord for minor issues at the property she herself occupied, and was responsible for maintaining in good order under her lease, including basic upkeep of things under her control, like not putting out unapproved gnomes. It was a level of oblivious audacity that bordered on the sublime. This was it. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. The pretext to visit her, not as a neighbor, but as the representative of the faceless corporation she was so keen to find. My plan solidified. It wasn't just about ousting her from the HOA presidency. It was about ensuring she understood, profoundly and personally, the consequences of her actions. President Karen was about to find out that when you meticulously weaponize rules against others, those same rules can be turned back on you with devastating precision, especially when the person you're targeting holds the deed to your house and the pen to your lease. The time for quiet evidence gathering was over. The trap was set, baited with her own spectacular misjudgment. And I had the distinct pleasure of knowing that the matches to burn down her little empire of aggravation were now firmly in my hand, along with a very comprehensive fire safety plan for everyone else. The beauty of Karen's self-inflicted wound, citing her own landlord for minor issues at her rented property, was its sheer, unadulterated arrogance. She genuinely believed Oak Lane Holdings LLC was some distant, disinterested corporate entity that would simply pay a fine or dispatch a hapless handyman. She had no idea she was essentially poking the bear that owned the cave she was living in. I decided against sending my property manager. This called for a personal touch. Claire, my attorney, had prepped all the necessary paperwork, formal notices of lease violations for Karen Crenshaw, citing harassment of another tenant, me, nuisance behavior, and now, interestingly, failing to maintain her own rented property to the standard she demanded of others via the HOA, and damage to LLC property via the glued lock, a demand for payment for the repairs to my lock at 12 Ashworth Lane, and a very pointed letter outlining the ownership structure of the majority of Willow Creek homes. I also had a copy of her lease, with all the relevant clauses neatly highlighted. I dressed professionally but unassumingly, no power suit, just smart business casual. I wanted the initial impact to come from the words, not the wardrobe. I rang the doorbell of 7 Privet Drive precisely at 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. Karen opened the door, a half-eaten croissant in one hand, already looking annoyed. "Yes?" she snapped, peering at me over her ubiquitous reading glasses. Clearly, she wasn't expecting anyone she recognized, especially not that difficult woman from Ashworth. "Good morning, Mrs. Crenshaw," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm here from Oak Lane Holdings LLC. We received your notice regarding some alleged maintenance issues at this property." Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. The internal cogs were visibly, if slowly, turning. "Oh," she said, a little flustered. "Well, it's about time. That fascia board is a disgrace. And the gnome, of course, completely unauthorized." She was already launching into her usual spiel, ready to lecture the faceless corporate drone she presumed I was. I let her go on for a moment, just enjoying the sheer absurdity of her complaining to me about conditions at her rented house, a house I owned. "Actually, Mrs. Crenshaw," I interjected smoothly, holding up a hand, "perhaps we could step inside. There are a few things we need to discuss regarding your tenancy and some other matters pertaining to Willow Creek Estates." Her brow furrowed. "My tenancy? There's nothing wrong with my tenancy." "I'm the HOA president," she huffed, as if that granted her diplomatic immunity from landlord-tenant law. "Indeed," I said, my smile polite but firm. "And it's in that capacity, and as the tenant of 7 Privet Drive, that we need to talk. You see, Karen, Oak Lane Holdings LLC? That's me, my company. I own this house, and quite a few others around here." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet statement landed with the force of a wrecking ball. Karen Crenshaw physically recoiled. The croissant slipped from her fingers and landed with a sad, buttery splat on her pristine welcome mat. Her face, normally a carefully composed mask of disdainful authority, went through a truly fascinating series of micro-expressions: confusion, dawning comprehension, utter disbelief, and then a wave of sickly pallor. You own this house?" she stammered, her voice suddenly 2 octaves higher. "But you live on Ashworth." "I do," I confirmed. "I own that one too, along with 14 Willow Way, where Mr. Gary Henderson lives. Your HOA board colleague, I believe? And 50 other properties within Willow Creek Estates. So, when you were sending those violation notices about my recycling bin, you were harassing a fellow resident. When you superglued my lock, and yes, I have the security footage, that flamingo brooch is quite distinctive, you were criminally damaging the property of your landlord, not to mention causing considerable distress and expense, all of which, I might add, are serious breaches of your lease agreement." I calmly handed her the sheaf of papers: the formal breach of lease, notice detailing her actions, the demand letter for the cost of the lock repair, and a clear statement outlining my LLC's holdings in the community. Her hands trembled as she took them, Her eyes darted from the papers to my face and back again, her usual bluster completely deflated. She looked, for the first time since I'd met her, small. This is outrageous, she finally managed. But the conviction was gone. It was the squawk of a cornered animal. The glue. That wasn't. You can't prove that. Oh, I think a judge might be interested in the footage, Karen, I said evenly. Along with Sal, the locksmith's affidavit, the police report, and testimony from other residents about your pattern of behavior. But let's focus on the lease for now. Clause 7b. Tenants shall not engage in any activity that unreasonably disturbs other residents or constitutes a nuisance. Your campaign against me at 12 Ashworth? Check. Clause 12. Tenant is responsible for damage to any property owned by landlord caused by tenant's willful acts or negligence. Gluing my lock? Big check. And now, ironically, your complaint about this property, I gestured vaguely at her house, could be seen as a failure on your part to maintain the premises in good order as per your own responsibilities detailed in Addendum A, not to mention the unauthorized gnome which violates community rules you, as HOA president, should be upholding at your own residence. The glue in her lock wasn't literal in my revenge. Not an act of vandalism. It was metaphorical. The documents I just handed her were the glue, systematically sealing shut every avenue of her power, every escape route. The ultimate lockout was coming. Her eviction from my property, not through malice, but through the methodical application of the very rules and contracts she'd so blithely ignored or weaponized. So, here are your options, Karen, I continued, my voice still quiet but utterly implacable. Option 1. You tender your immediate resignation as president of the Willow Creek OA. You provide a written apology for your actions. You pay for the damage to my property at 12 Ashworth Lane within 7 days. And your lease for 7 Privet Drive will be terminated at its natural end, with no option for renewal, provided there are no further incidents. Option 2. You refuse, and I will instruct my attorney to commence immediate eviction proceedings based on these clear breaches of your lease. We will also pursue all available legal remedies for the harassment and property damage, including civil action and cooperating fully with any police investigation. And, given my majority ownership in this community, I will call an immediate special HOA meeting to have you removed from the presidency anyway. The choice, I finished, is entirely yours. Her face was ashen. The fight had completely drained out of her. The cherry-red Mercedes in the driveway suddenly looked less like a symbol of status and more like a getaway car with nowhere to go. And Gary? She whispered, a note of desperation. Mr. Henderson has also received a notice regarding potential lease violations related to his conduct as an HOA board member enabling certain irregularities. His situation will be assessed based on his cooperation moving forward. The look on Karen Crenshaw's face as the full scope of her miscalculation crashed down upon her. The realization that her little kingdom was built on my land, with my bricks and mortar, overseen by rules I ultimately controlled, was a picture I will savor for a very long time. The glue she had so maliciously applied to my lock had, in a beautiful stroke of poetic justice, effectively and irrevocably sealed her own fate in Willow Creek. The Queen was not just checkmated, her entire board had been flipped. The silence that followed my ultimatum, stretched for what felt like an eternity, punctuated only by the frantic chirping of sparrows in Karen Crenshaw's meticulously, and ironically, given her citation to me, maintained birdbath. Her face was a ruin of collapsed arrogance. The flamingo brooch on her housecoat seemed to mock her with its garish cheerfulness. Finally, with a deflated sigh that seemed to suck all the bluster out of her, she sagged against the doorframe. I'll resign, she mumbled, not meeting my eyes. And I'll pay for the lock. It wasn't a triumphant roar of victory on my part, more a quiet, deeply satisfying click, like a well-oiled mechanism falling perfectly into place. The actual doing the same to their houses part of the story unfolded systematically, though not with literal glue. Karen, true to her word for once, submitted her resignation from the HOA presidency within hours. A brief, tersely worded email, citing personal reasons, was circulated to the community by the property management company, acting on my instructions for this transitional period. Gary Henderson, her nervous lieutenant, had received his own please explain letter regarding his complicity and some questionable votes he'd rubber-stamped. He folded faster than a cheap suit in a rainstorm, offering profuse apologies and eagerly distancing himself from Karen's reign. He would not be offered a lease renewal, but he was spared further action due to his newfound cooperativeness and what seemed like genuine, if weak-willed, remorse. Deirdre, the homeowner on the board, was aghast when she found out the extent of Karen's actions and my ownership. She'd been intimidated by Karen but wasn't malicious, just out of her depth. She readily agreed to support a restructuring. As for Karen's personal lockout, it was enacted with due process. She paid for the damages to my door, as agreed. However, her attitude, even in defeat, remained sour and begrudging. She couldn't quite shed the entitlement. Therefore, I instructed my property management company to issue a formal notice of non-renewal for her lease at 7 Privet Drive, giving her the legally required 60 days to vacate. She tried to argue, of course, tried to claim it was retaliatory. Claire, my attorney, gently but firmly pointed out that landlords are under no obligation to renew leases at the end of their term, especially with tenants who have a documented history of causing disturbances and breaching previous lease conditions, even if those breaches were resolved. The days ticked by. Karen became a ghost in the neighborhood. The cherry-red Mercedes was seen less and less. The HOA, in the interim, was essentially managed by my property company, pending a special meeting to elect a new, responsible board. The promised did the same to their houses really came into play with Karen when her lease termination date arrived. Predictably, she wasn't packed. She seemed to think if she just ignored it, the problem would go away. It didn't. On day 61, after proper legal notices had been posted, and the statutory period for her to vacate had expired, I, through my property manager and accompanied by a sheriff's deputy, as is standard procedure for a formal eviction where the tenant refuses to leave, regained possession of 7 Privet Drive. The locks were changed, legally, professionally, and decisively. That, my friends, was the ultimate glue in her locks. She was locked out, not by a petty act of vandalism, but by the entirely lawful consequence of her own sustained malice and her flagrant disregard for the agreements she had signed and the community rules she had so selectively enforced. Witnessing her meager belongings being removed by movers she'd hastily called, at her expense naturally, while the new high-security locks were being installed on my property, was a moment of profound, if somber, vindication. The other problematic individuals on her unofficial committee of petty tyrants, who happened to be my tenants and had been documented engaging in similar harassment tactics or clear lease violations, received their own non-renewal notices in due course. Not all at once, that would be disruptive, but as their leases came up, they were quietly replaced with tenants who understood the concept of neighborliness. Willow Creek Estates began to breathe again. The special HOA meeting was almost anticlimactic. With Karen gone and my majority ownership now known, though I presented it as a concerned collective of property interests seeking stable governance, we elected a new board composed of sensible, community-minded residents, a mix of actual homeowners, and some of my more responsible long-term tenants who genuinely cared about the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, with her newfound confidence, became the secretary, and her notes were a model of clarity and fairness. The first order of business for the new board was a complete overhaul of the bylaws. The absurd rules, the gnome diameter restrictions, the excessively seasonal wreath clause, the approved paint palettes that hadn't been updated since 1998 were systematically culled. Common sense prevailed. Fines that Karen had maliciously levied were reviewed and were unjust, rescinded with apologies. The atmosphere in Willow Creek transformed. People started smiling at each other again. There were spontaneous block parties. The oppressive cloud of Karen Crenshaw's reign had lifted. my own life became remarkably peaceful. No more bogus violation notices. No more hostile glares over the petunias. I could enjoy my home, my quiet street, my slightly longer than 2.5 inches in one patch grass, without fear of reprisal. My relationship with my tenants in Willow Creek also changed. Many of them knew I was the ultimate landlord who had stepped in. They saw me not as some faceless corporation, but as someone who valued fairness and wasn't afraid to clean house when necessary. Communication improved, issues were resolved collaboratively, and the whole community felt more like, well, a community. The cherry-red Mercedes was eventually spotted pulling a small U-Haul trailer out of Willow Creek for the last time. I never learned where Karen Crenshaw ended up, and frankly, I didn't care. Her chapter in Willow Creek was firmly and legally closed. So, that's the saga of how a little bit of superglue escalated into a full-blown property showdown. It was a masterclass in how unchecked power, even on the tiny scale of a suburban HOA, can corrupt, and how sometimes the quiet, unassuming person you decide to mess with might just own the entire board you're playing on. It taught me the value of knowing your rights, meticulous documentation, and the sweet, sweet satisfaction of watching a bully receive their perfectly legal, perfectly executed comeuppance. Karen Crenshaw learned the hard way. Never underestimate who might hold the deeds, and never, ever assume the rules only apply to others. Especially when your landlord has a very long memory and an excellent attorney. What's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard, or the most entitled person you've ever had to deal with? Drop your tales in the comments below. Misery loves company, but victory stories are even better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.